Threads of History, a podcast that aims to go back in time to connect an event or instance to its origin through several threads of continuity across time, space, culture, and historic moments. Welcome to the podcast. I am Mike Shellhammer. Today's episode is on the Scotch Irish migration to North America. When discussing a thread of history, it's hard to go earlier than the formation of continents on the Earth, which first happened 3.3 billion years ago. It technically isn't even history, since it's not written, and it happened in prehistory, measured in geological epochs and millions of years. Geology plays a part in this thread of history, which brings the continents together into Pangea, forms the coal seams that drove the Industrial Revolution, and brought the Scotch Irish from their homeland to the Americas to settle in the Appalachian Mountains, which strikingly resemble the mountains of Scotland, for good reason. Pangea is only the most recent supercontinent identified in the geological record. The forming of supercontinents and their breaking up appears to have been cyclical through Earth's history. There may have been several others, 4 of which are proposed to exist, before Pangea. Geologists have discovered this through studying the magnetism within the rocks. Paleomagnetic measurements help those geologists determine the latitude and orientation of ancient continental blocks, and newer techniques may help determine longitudes. Paleontology helps determine ancient climates, confirming latitude estimates from paleomagnetic measurements, and the distribution of ancient forms of life provides clues on which continental blocks were close to each other at particular geological moments. However, reconstructions of continents prior to the break of Pangea remain partially speculative. We know more about Pangea than any other supercontinents in the far Earth past, and that's for good reason. It's the most recent one, and there's the most evidence for it today. The geography of the continents bordering the Atlantic Ocean was the first evidence suggesting the existence of Pangea. The seemingly close fit of the coastlines of North and South America with Europe and Africa was remarked on almost as soon as these coasts were charted. The first to suggest that these continents were once joined and later separated may have been Abraham Ortelius in 1596. Careful reconstructions show that the mismatch at the 500 fathoms, or 300-foot contour, was less than 130 kilometers, or 81 miles, and it was argued that this was much too close to be attributed to chance. Additional evidence for Pangea is found in the geology of adjacent continents, including matching geological trends between the eastern coast of South America and the western coast of Africa. The polar ice cap of the Carboniferous period covered the southern end of Pangea. Glacial deposits, specifically till, of the same age and structure are found on many separate continents that would have been together in the supercontinent of Pangea. Fossil evidence for Pangea includes the presence of similar and identical species on continents that are now great distances apart. For example, fossils of the Listersaurus have been found in South Africa, India, and Antarctica, alongside members of the Glostoporus flora, whose distribution would have ranged from the polar circle to the equator if the continents had been in their present position. Similarly, the freshwater reptile Mesosaurus has been found in only localized regions on the coast of Brazil and Africa. Paleomagnetic study of apparent polar wandering paths also support the theory of a supercontinent. Geologists can determine the movement of continental plates by examining the orientation of magnetic minerals and rocks. When rocks are formed, they take on the magnetic properties of the Earth and indicate in which direction the poles lie relative to the rock. Since the magnetic poles drift about the rotational pole with a period of only a few thousand years, measurements from numerous lavas spanning several thousand years are averaged to give an apparent mean polar position. Samples of sedimentary rock and intrusive igneous rock have magnetic orientations that are typically an average of the what's called secular variation in the orientation of magnetic north, because their remnant magnetations are not acquired instantaneously. Magnetic differences between sample groups whose age varies by millions of years is due to a combination of true polar wander and the drifting of continents. The true polar wander component is identical for all samples and can be removed, leaving geologists with the portion of this motion that shows continental drift and can be used to help reconstruct earlier continental positions. It sounds crazy, but the orientation of magnetic material in rocks from 300 million years ago can tell today's geologists that the rock was somewhere other than where it is now on the Earth's surface. It's like reading a Pangean compass. The continuity of mountain chains provides further evidence for the formation of Pangea. One example of this is the Central Pangean Mountains, now called the Appalachian Mountains, which extends from the southeastern United States to the Caledonides of Ireland, Britain, Greenland, and Scandinavia, across the Atlantic Ocean. The Central Pangean Mountains were an extensive northeast to southwest trending mountain range in the central portion of the supercontinent Pangea during the Carboniferous, Permian, and Triassic periods. They were formed as a result of collisions between the minor supercontinents Laurussia and Gondwana during the formation of Pangea. At its greatest elevation, during the earlier part of the Permian period, the Central Pangean Mountains were comparable to the present-day Himalayas. Remnants of this massive mountain chain include the Appalachian Mountains and the Alchida Mountains of North America, the Little Atlas Mountains of Morocco in North Africa, and much of the Scottish Highlands in Scandinavia. This mountain range, ancient as it was, would not stay together. It broke apart with the continental drift of the plates in the Earth's crust, eventually splitting Pangea. The first phase of the breakup of Pangea began in the early to middle Jurassic period, about 175 million years ago, when Pangea began to rift from the Tethys Ocean in the east to the Pacific Ocean in the west. That rifting took place between North America and Africa, produced multiple failed rifts. One rift resulted in the new ocean, which would become the North Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean did not open uniformly. Rifting began in the North Central Atlantic. The South Atlantic did not open until the Cretaceous period, when Laurussia started to rotate clockwise and move northward with North America to the north and Eurasia to the south. The clockwise motion of Laurussia led much later to the closing of the Tethys Ocean and the widening of the Sinus Borealis, which later became the Arctic Ocean. The Appalachian Mountains have not only a geological, but also a cultural connection today. The Appalachian Mountains of North America lie between Flag Mountain in Alabama in the United States and the north end of Belle Isle in Canada's province of Newfoundland and Labrador. However, there is an organization that recognizes the connections made internationally and across the Atlantic Ocean. The International Appalachian Trail in North America was extended to Scotland several years ago and continues as what is known as the Caledonides of Ireland and Scotland. There are chapters of the International Appalachian Trail in places that were once joined by the Central Pangean Mountains, including the United States, Canada, Greenland, Iceland, the Isle of Man, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, France, Spain, Portugal, Morocco. You're catching North America, you're catching Scandinavia, you're catching the British Isles, you're catching West Europe, and you're also catching North Africa, all being connected through these ancient mountains. So as you can readily see, there is a connection between the Appalachian Mountains in North America and these other mountain ranges of Western Europe and North Africa through the Central Pangean Mountains. But that's not the only thread to be extended between modern America and Scotland of Ireland in the past. Deposits of coal run along the stretch of the Appalachian Mountains, and extend into the British Isles in multiple places. Much like the formation of the what we now call Appalachian Mountains, the conditions that would eventually create coal began to develop about 300 million years ago during the Carboniferous period and the formation of Pangea. During this time, the Earth was covered in wide, shallow seas and dense forests. The seas occasionally flooded the forest areas, trapping the plants and algae at the bottom of a swampy wetland. Over time, the plants, which were mostly mosses, and algae, were buried and compressed under the weight of overlying mud and vegetation. As the plant debris sifted deeper under Earth's surface, it encountered increased temperatures and higher pressure. Mud and acidic water prevented the plant matter from coming into contact with oxygen. Due to this, the plant matter decomposed at a very slow rate and retained most of its carbon, which would become a source of energy. These areas of buried plant matter are called peat bogs. Peat bogs store massive amounts of carbon many meters underground. The peat itself can be burned for fuel and is a major source of heat energy in countries such as Scotland and Ireland. Under the right conditions, peat transforms into coal through a process called carbonization. Carbonization takes place under incredible heat and pressure. About 3 meters or 10 feet of layered vegetation eventually compresses into a third of a meter, about 1 foot, of coal. Coal exists in underground formations called coal seams or coal beds. A coal seam can be as thick as 30 meters, 90 feet, and stretch for as many as 920 miles. Coal seams exist on every continent. In the United States, coal is mined in 25 states and 3 major regions. One of these regions is the Appalachian coal region, in which I live. More than 1/3 of the nation's coal comes from the Appalachian coal region, which includes West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. The British Isles have a long history of coal mining, much of it done by those living in the heavily mined regions of Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Great Britain's coal fields are associated with Northumberland and Durham, North and South Wales, Yorkshire, the Scottish Central Belt, Lancashire, Cumbria, and East and West Midlands, and Kent. In Ireland, primary coal mining was done in the Connacht province in northwestern Ireland, but never on the scale that was done in Great Britain. Scotland has an interesting history when it comes to its coal miners, which might inform us of the reasons for many of them to seek out a new life in North America. You see, in the 17th and 18th centuries, coal miners in Scotland and their families were bound to the colliery in which they worked and the service of its owner. This bondage was set into law by an Act of Parliament in 1606, which ordained that, quote, no person should fee, hire, or conduce and salters, colliers, or coal bearers without a written authority from the master whom they had last served, unquote. A collier lacking such written authority could be reclaimed by his former master within a year and a day. If the new master did not surrender the collier, he could be fined, and the collier who deserted was considered to be a thief and punished accordingly. The act also gave the coal owners and masters the powers to apprehend, quote, vagabonds and sturdy beggars, unquote, and put them to work in the mines. A further act of 1641 extended those enslaved to include other workers in the mines and forced the colliers to work 6 days a week. The process of emancipation began with an Act of Parliament of 1775, which freed the colliers in age groups. Those under 21 and between 35 and 44 were to be freed in 7 years. Those between 21 and 34 were to be freed in 10 years, and those over 45 were to be freed in 3 years. The liberation of the father freed the family. However, gaining freedom required a formal legal application before a sheriff, and a great many colliers continued to be bound until 1799, when an act was passed that all colliers in Scotland were to be free from their servitude. It's such an odd note in history to see legal slavery in an industry like coal mining, it makes me think of slaves in the Roman Empire being forced into going into mines, silver mines, lead mines, whatever they may be. And here we've got it just a couple hundred years ago. It's crazy to me to think about people being bound to the master of a mine and then not being able to go anywhere else without the permission of that master. This coal mining connection can be considered another thread, which links the central Pangean mountains to the Appalachian range of North America, which has coal deposits of the same age of those in the British Isles, which were mined by workers who had good reason to emigrate to a new country, where they could have freedom of movement and the full use of their free wills. This takes us to the last thread in this episode, which is the Scotch Irish cultural group in North America. Scotch Irish Americans, or sometimes called Scots Irish, are American descendants of Ulster Protestants who immigrated from Ulster in Northern Ireland to America during the 18th and 19th centuries. Those ancestors had originally migrated mainly from the Scottish lowlands, northern England, and sometimes from the Anglo-Scottish border. In the 2017 American Community Survey, 5.39 million, which is 1.7% of the overall population, reported Scottish ancestry, and an additional 3 million, which is about 1% of the population, identified more specifically with Scotch Irish ancestry, and many people who claim quote-unquote American ancestry may actually be of Scotch Irish ancestry. The term Scotch Irish is used primarily in the United States, with people in Great Britain or Ireland who are of a similar ancestry identifying as Ulster Scots. Many left for America, but over 100,000 Scottish Presbyterians still lived in Ulster in 1700. Many English-born settlers of this period were also Presbyterians. When King Charles I attempted to force these Presbyterians into the Church of England in the 1630s, many chose to re-emigrate to North America, where religious liberty was greater. Later attempts to force the Church of England's control over dissident Protestants in Ireland led to further waves of emigration to the transatlantic colonies. Scholars estimate that over 200,000 Scotch Irish migrated to the Americas between 1717 and 1775. As a late arriving group, they found that land in the coastal areas of the British colonies was either already owned or simply too expensive, so they quickly left for the more mountainous interior where land could be obtained less expensively. Here they lived on the first frontier of America. Early frontier life was challenging, but poverty and hardship were familiar to them. The term hillbilly has often been applied to their descendants in the mountains, carrying connotations of poverty, backwardness, and homegrown violence. Those connotations are most often given to them by their detractors, who are eager to disparage them for keeping their cultural identities and not assimilating as well into the Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity of more quote-unquote mainstream America. The first trickle of Scotch-Irish settlers arrived in New England. Valued for their fighting prowess as well as for their Protestant dogma, they were invited by Cotton Mather of the Salem witch trials fame, and other early colonial leaders to come over to help settle and secure the frontier. In this capacity, many of the first permanent settlements in Maine and New Hampshire, especially after 1718, were Scotch-Irish, and many place names, as well as the character of northern New Englanders, reflect this fact. The Scotch-Irish brought the potato with them from Ireland. Although the potato originated in South America, it was not known in North America until brought over from Europe again centuries later. Potatoes became a staple crop, as well as an economic base for these areas in the frontier. From 1717 onward, for the next 30 or so years, the primary points of entry for the Ulster immigrants were Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Newcastle, Delaware. The Scotch-Irish radiated westward across the Alleghenies, as well as into Virginia, North Carolina and South Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The typical migration involved small networks of related families who settled together, worshiped together, and then intermarried, strongly avoiding and weary of outsiders. Without much cash, many Scotch Irish moved to free lands on the frontier, becoming the typical Western squatters, the frontier guard of the colonies, and what the historian Frederick Jackson Turner described as the, quote, cutting edge of the frontier, unquote. The Scotch Irish moved up the Delaware River to Bucks County, and then up the Susquehanna and Cumberland valleys, finding flat lands along the rivers and creeks to set up their log cabins, their grist mills, and their Presbyterian churches. Chester, Lancaster, and Dauphin counties became their strongholds, and they built towns such as Chambersburg, Gettysburg, Carlisle, and York. The next generation moved into western Pennsylvania, which is my neck of the woods. With large numbers of children who needed their own inexpensive farms, the Scotch Irish would also move south through the Shenandoah Valley and through the Blue Ridge Mountains into Virginia. These migrants followed the Great Wagon Road from Lancaster through Gettysburg and down through Staunton, Virginia, to what is now Roanoke, Virginia. Here the pathway split, with the Wilderness Road taking settlers west into Tennessee and Kentucky, while the main road continued south into the Carolinas. The Scotch Irish, being located on the frontier, would bring them into conflict with Native Americans. As they were settling the frontier of Pennsylvania and western Virginia, they were called upon to fight in the French and Indian War and in Pontiac's rebellion that followed it. The Scotch Irish were frequently in conflict with the Indian tribes who lived on the other side of the frontier, and indeed they did most of the Indian fighting on the American frontier, from New Hampshire to the Carolinas. The Scotch Irish were often called upon to be the middlemen who handled trade and negotiations between Native American tribes and the colonial governments. Especially in Pennsylvania, the conflict between colonists and native peoples of the Americas would flare up and cause atrocities. The pacifist Quaker leaders had made no provision for a militia, so the Scotch-Irish settlements were frequently destroyed and the settlers inside them killed, captured, or forced to flee after attacks by Native Americans. Reportedly involved were tribes of the Delaware, which are Lenape, Shawnee, Seneca, and others of western Pennsylvania and the Ohio country. Native American attacks took place within 60 miles of Philadelphia, and in July 1763, the Pennsylvania Assembly authorized a 700-strong militia to be raised, to be used only for defensive actions. Formed into two units of Rangers, the Cumberland Boys and the Paxton Boys, the militia soon exceeded their defensive mandate and began offensive forays against Lenape villages in western Pennsylvania. After attacking Delaware villages in the upper Susquehanna Valley, the militia leaders received information which they believed credible, that hostile tribes were receiving weapons and ammunition from the friendly tribe of Conestogas, who were settled in Lancaster County and under the official protection of the Pennsylvania Assembly. On the 14th of December, 1763, about 50 Paxton Boys rode into Conestoga Town near Millersville, Pennsylvania, and murdered 6 Conestogas. Governor John Penn placed the remaining 14 Conestogas in protective custody in the Lancaster workhouse, but the Paxton Boys broke in, killing and mutilating all 14 of them. Following this, about 400 backcountry settlers, primarily Scotch-Irish, marched on Philadelphia demanding better militia protection for their settlements and pardons for the Paxton Boys. Benjamin Franklin led the politicians who negotiated a settlement with the Paxton leaders, after which they returned home. The Scotch-Irish would also be involved in the next conflict to engulf the continent, the American Revolution. The United States Declaration of Independence contained 56 delegate signatures. Of the signers, 8 were of Irish descent. 2 signers, George Taylor and James Smith, were born in Ulster. The remaining 5 Irish Americans, George Reed, Thomas McKean, Thomas Lynch, Jr., Edward Rutledge, and Charles Carroll, were the sons or grandsons of Irish immigrants, and McKean is confirmed to have had Ulster heritage. In contrast to the Scottish Highlanders, the Scotch-Irish were generally ardent supporters of American independence from Britain in the 1770s. In Pennsylvania, Virginia, and most of the Carolinas, support for the revolution was practically unanimous. One Hessian officer said, quote, "Call this war by whatever name you may, only call it not an American rebellion. It is nothing more or less than a Scotch Irish Presbyterian rebellion." Unquote. A British Major General testified to the House of Commons that, quote, "half the rebel Continental Army were from Ireland." Unquote. In fact, in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, with its large Scotch-Irish population, they made the first declaration for independence from Britain in what's called the Mecklenburg Declaration of 1775. The Scotch-Irish of Virginia and North Carolina were called the Overmountain Men and formed a militia which won the Battle of Kings Mountain in 1780, resulting in the British abandonment of the Southern strategy, and for some historians, marked the turning point of the American Revolution. The Scotch-Irish would be involved in later, more philosophical conflicts like the Whiskey Rebellion, but the Whiskey Rebellion will be a topic for another episode of Threads of History. Scotch-Irish people in America would also contribute to the wider fabric of American society. They would contribute to the industrial and cultural history of America. Industrial America especially would get a boost from Scottish immigrants. The iron and steel industry developed rapidly after 1830 and became one of the dominant factors in industrial America by the 1860s. Researchers examined the leadership of the industry in its most important center, Pittsburgh, as well as in smaller cities. They concluded that the leadership of the iron and steel industry nationwide was largely Scotch-Irish. The Scotch-Irish held together cohesively throughout the 19th century and were said to have developed their own sense of uniqueness. New immigrants after 1800 made Pittsburgh a major Scotch-Irish stronghold. For a local example to Pittsburgh, Thomas Mellon, who was born in Ulster in 1813, left Ireland in 1823 and became the founder of the famous Mellon clan, which played a central role in banking and industries such as aluminum and oil. Industrialists such as James H. Laughlin, who was born in Ulster in 1806, of the Jones and Laughlin Steel Company, constituted the Scotch-Irish Presbyterian ruling stratum of the Pittsburgh society. Folklore of Appalachia drew heavily on Scottish origins. Archaeologists and folklorists have examined the folk culture of the Scotch-Irish in terms of material goods, such as housing, as well as speech patterns and folk songs. Much of this research has been done in Appalachia. Studies by folklorists have pointed to the unique origin for these Scotch-Irish people coming to the United States, especially those that settled in the Appalachian Mountains. Elements of mountain folklore trace back to events in the lowlands of Scotland. As an example, it was recorded in the early 20th century that Appalachian children were frequently warned, quote, "You must be good or clavers will get you," unquote. To the mountain residents, clavers was simply a boogeyman used to keep children in line. Yet unknown to them, the phrase derives from the 17th century Scotsman John Graham of Claverhouse, called the Bloody Clavers by the Presbyterian Scottish Lowlanders, whose religion he tried to suppress. The Scotch-Irish people were among some of the first European settlers, and along with other colonists from the British Isles, helped create what has been recognized as the dominant culture in America, namely white and Protestant. By working hard and seizing the opportunities of a rapidly growing country, many Scottish immigrants were able to move up rapidly in American society. Unaffected by barriers of race, language, or religion, they earned a reputation for hard work and thrift that was greatly admired in the young republic. Perhaps the most notable among this group is one of America's most successful immigrants, the industrialist Andrew Carnegie. After arriving in America at the age of 13, he worked first in a cotton mill, then as a superintendent for the Pennsylvania Railroad. By shrewd investments, he parlayed his Carnegie Steel Company into a huge fortune. In his famous essay called The Gospel of Wealth, he described his rationale for philanthropy. Carnegie donated hundreds of millions of dollars, in today's money, to build public libraries, endow universities, and fund scholarships. His most famous gift is one of New York's most beautiful public buildings, Carnegie Hall, which has hosted the world's most distinguished performers in the lively arts. Carnegie believed that wealth acquired by hard work should be shared with society, but on his terms. For example, Carnegie was bitterly opposed to unionization in his steel plants, and he was behind the murder of strikers in the Homestead strike at his plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania in 1892. Carnegie has a local connection for me because he paid the money to build the local library, and he was also a member of what's called the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, which will also be part of another Thread of History episode coming up. The Scotch Irish are relatively unscathed by their ethnic stereotyping. However, the phrase cold as Presbyterian charity reflects the long-standing belief that Scotch Irish are dour and stingy. This seems to be lessening, although brand names such as Scotch Tape reinforce the idea that to be Scottish or Scotch Irish is to be thrifty. There's also the persistence of the hillbilly legend, which portrays Appalachian residents as ill-clad, unshod bumpkins fond of brewing moonshine, which is bootleg whiskey. This image became widespread with the Lil Abner comic strip drawn by Al Capp beginning in 1932. The strip reached 60 million readers and became first a Broadway musical and then a film in 1959. In the 1960s, a CBS television series, The Beverly Hillbillies, and its spin-offs Petticoat Junction and Green Acres, furthered the image of rural people as simpletons. The dignity of most rural Southern life has emerged, however, with the publication of the Foxfire books in the 1970s and the efforts of folklorists to preserve and document a vanishing way of life. Appalshop, a rural arts and education center in Whitesburg, Kentucky, exemplifies the effort to preserve the Scottish and Scotch-Irish heritage of Appalachia on film and also in recorded music. The historical figure most associated with the best aspects of this tradition is the pioneer Daniel Boone, who lived from 1734 to 1820, whose life has been celebrated in song and story, as well as movies and television. Daniel Boone was a trailblazer and patriot who continues to capture the imaginations of Americans. John Muir, Scottish-born naturalist, was reared as a strict Calvinist and reacted to a near loss of his eyesight in an accident by a spiritual quest for the natural world. He began a walk on foot across the continent and fiercely advocated the preservation of the wilderness. He influenced President Theodore Roosevelt to become a conservationist. The national parks are a tribute to his foresight and love of America's natural beauty. Through these examples, we have the incredibly important contributions from the Scotch-Irish immigrant groups to American and world history. They primarily settled in the Appalachian Mountains, which contained coal created 300 million years ago, when the Appalachians were known as the Central Pangean Mountains. It is interesting to see how they emigrated for religious freedom and better opportunities to settle in an area that most likely reminded them of home, not knowing that the mountains they inhabited in America were the same mountains that ran through their homelands. This is a thread of history that has its origins in the formation of the Earth. I'm not sure if I'll go beyond 300 million years ago in another thread of history. We'll have to see about that. That was episode 3 on the Scotch-Irish immigrant group in North America. This has been Threads of History. I am Mike Shellhammer. Thank you for listening. You can listen to more Threads of History on Anchor, Spotify, and now Google Podcasts. You can email your thoughts and suggestions to threads.historypodcast@gmail.com.